The council chamber stretched across a space so vast that the far walls disappeared into a soft blue haze. Ambassador Kyle Bennett sat in the human delegation section and watched the other species argue about matters that would never include his people in any meaningful way. He had been doing this for 5 years now, and before him, 3 other ambassadors had done the same thing for a combined total of 200 years. 200 years of humanity trying to prove themselves worthy of a seat at the table they were already sitting at. The Varaxians were talking again. They always talked the most because their species had been part of the council for over 6,000 years, and they never let anyone forget it. Their current speaker was a tall being named Thrix, who had scales that shifted between purple and gold depending on his mood. Right now, they were a deep, angry purple as he gestured with his forearms at the display screen showing human trade routes. The humans asked for more shipping lanes through Sector 9, but what have they contributed to deserve such privileges? Thrix said with a tone that made it clear he expected no real answer. Their technology is borrowed from us, and their military exists only because we trained them, and their entire civilization would collapse without council support. Dodd felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his face neutral. Lisa Morgan sat behind him in the observer seats, and he could feel her tension even without looking back. She had been his communications officer for 3 years, and she knew him well enough to recognize when he was reaching his limit. That limit was getting closer every single day. The Zelthari Prime Minister spoke next from her elevated platform. That put her above everyone else in a not-so-subtle display of superiority. Her species looked almost human, except for the silver skin and eyes that had no pupils at all. "The human petition for expanded trade rights is premature," she said in a voice like cold water. "They have been provisional members for 2 centuries. But provisional means they are still learning and still proving themselves. And we cannot grant full member privileges to a species that has not earned them." Kyle stood up slowly. The chamber had rules about when lower species could speak, and humans were definitely considered a lower species despite everything they had done. But he had followed the rules for 5 years and watched his predecessors follow them for decades before that, and he was done with rules that were designed to keep humanity in its place. "Provisional for 200 years, Kyle said, and his voice carried across the chamber because the acoustics were designed to amplify whoever was standing. "We have fought in 17 council wars, and we have lost over 4 million people defending council territory, and we have provided technological innovations that most of you now use every single day, and we have asked for nothing except to be treated as equals." The chamber went quiet in the way that happens when someone breaks an unspoken rule. Several delegates looked uncomfortable, while others looked amused at the human's outburst. Thrix's scales shifted to an even darker purple, which Kyle had learned meant the Vraxian was about to say something particularly insulting. "Fought in our wars with adequate results at best," Thrix said with a dismissive wave of one arm. "Provided innovations that were merely variations on existing council technology, and asked for nothing except everything you have not earned." He paused, and his scales shifted to include streaks of orange, which meant he was enjoying himself. "Perhaps in another 200 years. Your species will have matured enough for full membership, but today you are still children playing at civilization." The other delegates made various sounds of agreement. The Korthon representative actually laughed, which was a sound like grinding metal. Kyle looked around the chamber at all these species who had used human blood and human ideas and human labor for 2 centuries while treating them like useful pets. Greg Palmer sat 2 seats down from Kyle, and he was already gathering his things. Greg had been the chief diplomat for the human delegation for 8 years, and Kyle had never seen him give up on a negotiation, but right now, Greg was putting his datapad into his case with deliberate care. On Kyle's other side, Amy Carter, who handled military liaison, was doing the same thing. Amy had lost her brother in the last council war, and she had stayed as professional through the funeral and the medal ceremony and every diplomatic function after, but Kyle could see something breaking behind her eyes. Right now, Lisa stood up in the observer section. She was not supposed to move during council sessions, but she was moving now and walking down to where the human delegation sat. She handed Kyle a datapad without saying anything, and on the screen was a single word that said "agreed with signatures" from every human colony and every Earth government. They had talked about this possibility for months in private channels. Every human leader had been asked the same question, which was what happens if the Council never respects us? The answer on the datapad was clear. The Council would not treat humanity as equals, then humanity would treat the Council as irrelevant. Kyle picked up his folder with all his carefully prepared arguments for why humans deserved equal voting rights. He had statistics about human contributions to Council, defense, and graphs, showing human economic input and reports from a dozen Council species praising human medical research. None of it mattered because the Council had already decided that humans would never be good enough. "We are done here," Kyle said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber anyway. He tucked the folder under his arm and looked at the Zelthari Prime Minister directly, which was another rule he was breaking. Humanity withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately. For a moment, nobody moved. The concept was too strange for them to process. Species did not leave the Council because where else would they go? The galaxy was a dangerous place. And the Council provided protection and trade and technology. Leaving the Council meant isolation and poverty and eventual extinction. Then Thrix laughed and several other delegates joined him. "You cannot survive without us," the Vraxian said with complete confidence. "You will be back within a year begging for readmission, and perhaps then you will have learned humility." Kyle did not respond. He walked toward the exit, and Greg and Amy walked with him. Lisa fell in step behind them, and as they passed the observer section, 36 other human staff members stood and followed. They walked past the Korthon delegation, and the Phalanx representatives, and the Iridian cluster, and nobody tried to stop them because nobody believed they were serious. The doors to the Council chamber were massive things carved from stone, taken from the homeworld of the first Council species. They had been standing for 10,000 years, and they had seen species rise and fall and merge and split, but they had never seen a species just walk away. Kyle put his hand on the door and pushed it open and stepped through into the corridor beyond. Behind them, the Council chamber erupted into noise as delegates argued about what this meant and whether it was legal and how quickly the humans would come back. The Zelthari Prime Minister was calling for order, and Thrix was already making jokes about human pride coming before their fall. None of them noticed that every single human in the building was walking toward the exits. None of them thought to ask why the humans seemed so calm about leaving. None of them wondered what humanity had been planning during those 200 years of being treated like children. Kyle reached the transport bay, where ships waited to take delegates back to their home sectors. The human vessel was a simple design that the Council had always considered primitive. Lisa brought up the passenger list and confirmed that every human on the station was accounted for and ready to leave. "Send the signal," Kyle said. Lisa pressed a button on her datapad and across 17 sectors of Council space, every human received the same message: "Come home." 48 hours later, the real chaos would begin, but right now, Kyle just wanted to get off this station and never see it again. The human ship lifted off and turned toward Earth, and Kyle did not look back at the Council building. He had spent 5 years trying to earn respect that was never going to come, and now he was done trying. Humanity would find its own way forward, and the Council could figure out what they had lost. It would take them a while, but eventually they would understand, and by then, it would be far too late. Captain Jenny Blake stood on the bridge of her transport ship and watched the evacuation orders scroll across her screen. Every human in Council space was being called home, and she had 48 hours to get her people off Station Kepler 9 and back to human territory. The station was one of the largest in this sector, and it housed over 3,000 humans who worked in various departments from engineering to medical research to station maintenance. The station commander was a Vraxian named Kelth, who had always treated the human workers with barely concealed contempt. He called them assistants and helpers, even though Jenny knew that most of the humans on this station were doing the actual work while their alien supervisors took credit for it. She had watched this pattern for 7 years and had said nothing, because speaking up meant risking humanity's position in the Council, but now none of that mattered anymore. Jenny walked through the corridors toward the main engineering section where most of her people worked. The station was a sieve, and it took 15 minutes to reach the engineering bay, even using the rapid transit system. When she arrived, she found Danny Foster working on one of the primary life support processors, while his supposed supervisor stood nearby, talking to someone on a communication device. "Danny," Jenny said quietly, and the young engineer looked up from his work. "Pack your tools and gather your team." Danny glanced at his supervisor, who had not noticed Jenny's arrival. "Captain, we are in the middle of a critical repair, and if I stop now, the system will fail within 3 days. "Then it fails within 3 days, Jenny said, and kept her voice level. "We are leaving, and we are leaving now." The supervisor finally looked over, and his scales shifted to an annoyed yellow color. "The humans cannot leave in the middle of essential maintenance," he said with the tone of someone talking to a disobedient pet. "They will complete their assigned work and then request permission for departure through proper channels." Jenny pulled out her datapad and showed him the official withdrawal notice that had been filed with Council headquarters. "Humanity has left the Council, and all human personnel are returning home immediately." The supervisor stared at the screen for a long moment and then made a dismissive gesture. "Impossible, and besides, you cannot take the humans because they are assigned to this station under contract." "Those contracts were with the Council, and humanity is no longer part of the Council," Jenny said. She turned to Danny and raised her voice so the other humans in the engineering bay could hear. "Everyone pack up and meet at Docking Bay 7 in 2 hours." The engineering bay had 17 humans working various stations, and they all stopped what they were doing. Some looked uncertain, while others looked relieved, but all of them started gathering their personal tools and equipment. The supervisor's scales went from yellow to deep red, which meant he was becoming truly angry. "You cannot do this," he said, and moved to block the exit. "This station requires human workers to function properly." "Then you should have treated us like equals instead of servants," Jenny said, and walked past him. The supervisor tried to grab her arm, but Danny stepped between them and the Varaxian backed down because humans were not physically weak even if the Council treated them that way. Jenny spent the next 6 hours going through every department on the station and pulling out human personnel. In the medical research wing, she found Dr. Kate Sullivan working on a cure for a disease that affected 3 different Council species. Kate's supervisor tried to insist that she could not leave until the research was complete, but Kate just saved her work to a private drive and deleted everything from the station computers. "That research represents 2 years of work," the supervisor said in shock. "Then you should. I've been paying attention to how I was doing it," Kate replied, and walked out with her team of 9 other human researchers. In the agricultural section, Jenny found Lisa Morgan's brother Tim, who managed the food production systems that fed 12,000 station residents. Tim explained that he had designed new growing protocols that increased yield by 40% and had trained his alien staff on basic maintenance, but nobody had bothered to learn the advanced systems because they assumed humans would always be there to handle it. "What happens when the systems break down?" Tim's supervisor asked with growing panic in his voice. Tim said, and started disconnecting his personal equipment from the station. Network. The pattern repeated in every department. Humans had been placed in positions labeled as assistants or junior technicians or support staff, but in reality, they were running entire operations while aliens with fancy titles took credit and pay. Now those operations were about to lose the people who actually knew how they worked. Station Commander Kelth finally understood the scope of the problem when Jenny brought the last group of humans to the docking bay. He arrived with 6 security officers and blocked the entrance to the bay, where 3 human transport ships were waiting. "I cannot allow you to leave," Kelth said, and his scales were shifting through multiple colors, which meant he was experiencing several emotions at once. "This station will collapse without human workers." Jenny had been expecting this confrontation. "You have 2 choices," she said calmly. "You let us leave peacefully, or we disable every system we installed or modified before we go." Kelth's scales went pure white, which meant fear. "That would be sabotage." "No, that would be removing our own work," Jenny corrected. "We built most of the critical systems on this station, and we have every right to take our designs with us." She pulled out her datapad and showed him a list of systems that had human fingerprints all over them. The life support upgrades that Danny had designed, the medical equipment that Kate had modified, the agricultural systems that Tim had revolutionized, the power distribution network that had been failing until human engineers rebuilt it 3 years ago. The security protocols that actually worked unlike the Council versions. You built all of this? Kelth asked, and his voice was quiet now. We built most of this station's functional systems over the past 20 years, Jenny said. Your people designed the pretty parts, but we made everything actually work, and now we are leaving. Kelth looked at the 3,000 humans gathered in the docking bay and finally seemed to understand what was happening. We never realized how much you were doing. You never asked, Jenny said. She turned to her people and raised her voice. Load up and prepare for departure. The humans moved toward the transport ships in organized groups. They had been planning this evacuation for weeks because they knew the Council would not let them go isolated. Every person knew which ship they were assigned to and where their duties were during flight. It took 30 minutes to load everyone and secure the cargo. Jenny was the last to board her ship. She stood at the airlock and looked back at Kelth, who was still standing there with his security team. For what it is worth, she said, some of you were not terrible to work with. What will we do when the systems start failing? Kelth asked. The same thing you always told us to do, Jenny replied. Figure it out yourselves. The airlock closed and Jenny made her way to the bridge. Her pilot was already running through the departure sequence and the other. 2 transport ships were reporting ready status. Through the viewport, she could see the massive bulk of station. Kepler 9 with its gleaming towers and beautiful architecture that hid the failing systems. Underneath, all ships report ready for jump. Her pilot said, Take us home, Jenny ordered. The 3 ships lifted away from the station and aligned for the jump to human space. Behind them, Station Kepler 9 was already experiencing its first system failures as automated processes that relied on human oversight began to break down. Within days, the problems would cascade into critical failures, and within weeks, the station would be uninhabitable unless the Council figured out how to fix what they had never bothered to learn. Jenny watched the station shrink in the viewport as her ship accelerated. She thought about all the years she had spent there trying to earn respect from people who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. She thought about all the innovations that humans had contributed only to have them credited to Council scientists. She thought about the 4 million humans who had died in Council wars, fighting for a civilization that never appreciated them. The ships entered jump space, and Station Kepler 9 disappeared from view. Jenny pulled up her communication console and saw similar reports coming in from 16 other sectors. Humans were evacuating from research stations and military outposts, in trade hubs, and everywhere. They left behind systems that were about to fail and aliens who were starting to panic. Captain, we are getting emergency messages from the SHE station, her communications officer reported. They are requesting we return to help with critical system failures. Jenny thought about responding and then decided against it. Ignore all messages from Council space, she said. We are going home. The transport ships continued their journey. Through jump space and behind them, the Council was beginning to understand what they had lost, but it would take time for the full scope to become clear, and by then, humanity would be gone, and there would be no calling them back. 3 months had passed since the humans walked out, and the Council chamber was filled with an tension that Ambassador Thrix had never experienced in his 40 years of service. The emergency session had been called because the reports coming in from every sector were painting a picture that nobody wanted to believe. The Grand Galactic Council that had maintained order for 10,000 years was falling apart, and it had taken only 90 days without humans for the cracks to become canyons. Thrix stood at his delegation podium and looked at the datapad in his primary hand while his other 3 hands hung limp at his sides. His scales were a dull gray, which was the Varixian color for shame and confusion. He had been the one who mocked the humans most loudly, and now he had to deliver the report that proved exactly how wrong he had been. The economic analysis is complete, Thrix said, and his voice lacked its usual confidence. Council trade has declined by 32% across all sectors, and the primary cause is the collapse of secure shipping lanes that were maintained by human security forces. The Zelthari Prime Minister leaned forward in her elevated seat. "We have our own security forces, SH," E said, but her voice was uncertain. "They should be able to maintain the shipping lanes without human assistance." Thrix felt his scales darken further. "Our security forces are adequate for patrolling established safe zones? But the humans were the ones who actually cleared the pirate nests and established those safe zones in the first place." He pulled up a tactical map that showed red zones spreading across what had been safe territory just 3 months ago. "Without human hunter-killer teams, the pirates have returned, and they are bolder than before." A delegate from the Phalanx cluster spoke up. "How many ships have we lost?" 47 merchant vessels in the past 90 days, Thrix replied. "That is more than we lost in the previous 5 years combined, and the number is accelerating because the pirates now know we cannot effectively respond to their attacks." The chamber filled with worried murmuring. The council economy depended on safe trade routes, and if merchants could not move goods safely, then entire systems would face shortages and economic collapse. Several delegates started shouting questions, but the Prime Minister called for order. "Military Commander." Vex took the podium next. He was a Korthon, which meant he stood nearly 8 feet tall and had armor plating that covered most of his body. Korthons were considered the finest warriors in council space, and Vex had led forces in dozens of campaigns. Right now, his usually proud bearing was bent with exhaustion. "The military situation is critical," Vex said without preamble. "The defensive perimeter that has protected council space for 60 years is failing, and we do not have the technical expertise to repair it." The Prime Minister's silver skin seemed to lose some of its luster. "Explain how this is possible," she demanded. "The defensive perimeter was a council project that involved hundreds of our best engineers." Vex pulled up a schematic of the perimeter network. The defensive perimeter was designed by council engineers, but it was implemented and maintained entirely by human technicians. He highlighted sections of the network that were going dark. "The system relies on a complex network of early warning satellites and automated defensive platforms, and the integration between these systems was far more sophisticated than we realized." "Did we not have our own people trained on these systems?" someone asked from the back of the chamber. "We did," Vex replied, and his voice was bitter. "But the humans were always the ones who actually fixed problems. When they arose, and our people only learned the basic maintenance procedures, and now we are discovering that basic maintenance is not enough when dealing with cascade failures across hundreds of systems." A Ridian delegate stood up. "Can we not simply hire human technicians to return and repair the systems?" "We have tried," Vex said. "Every message to human governments has gone unanswered, and the few human civilian contractors we contacted have declined our offers regardless of the payment amounts." Thrix returned to the podium as Vex stepped down. "The economic and military reports are concerning, but there is another issue that may be even more critical." He pulled up medical statistics that made several delegates gasp. "Our medical research programs have effectively stopped, and ongoing treatments for several major diseases are failing." Dr. Hayes moved to the podium. She was one of the few Korthons who had chosen medical research over military service, and she had worked alongside human researchers for 20 years. Her face showed a level of distress that was unusual for her normally stoic species. "The Vardex plague research has completely halted," Hayes said, and her voice was strained. "Dr. Kate Sullivan and her human team were responsible for 70% of the breakthrough work in this area, and when they left, they took all of their research data with them. They deleted council property." The Prime Minister asked sharply. Hayes shook her head. "They deleted their own work from council systems and took the only copies with them, and this is entirely legal under council research guidelines because the primary researcher owns their data until publication." She pulled up casualty numbers. "Without their research, we have no way to continue treatment development, and the Vardex plague is now spreading unchecked through 4 different species populations." "How many dead?" Someone asked quietly. 12,000 in the past month alone, Hayes replied. That number will reach 1,000,000 within 6 months if we cannot resume treatment development. The chamber fell silent as the reality of the situation settled over everyone present. The council had not just lost workers or assistants or helpful support staff. They had lost the people who were actually holding their civilization. Together, while the council took credit and handed out praise to themselves, Thrix felt a presence beside him and turned to see the Prime Minister had descended from her elevated platform for the first time in his memory. Her silver skin looked almost gray in the chamber lighting. How did we not see this? She asked, and the question was directed at Thrix, but also at herself and everyone else present. We saw what we wanted to see, Thrix replied. We saw humans doing jobs we considered beneath us, and we assumed those jobs were simple because we did not bother to look closely. The scale shifted through several colors as he struggled with emotions he rarely felt. Every time a human proposed a solution, we took that solution and assigned credit to one of our own people, and we never asked how the solution actually worked. Hayes joined them. I worked with human researchers for 20 years, she said. They would show me their methods and explain their reasoning, and I would nod and take notes, but I never truly tried to understand, because I assumed I could always just ask them if I needed help, and now they are gone, and I realize I learned almost nothing. Prime Minister looked around the chamber at all the delegates who were having similar realizations. We need to bring them back, she said. We need to offer them whatever they want to return. And what can we offer them? Thrix asked. Full council membership? Equal voting rights? These are things we should have given them 200 years ago. He pulled up a recent intelligence report. Our scouts have monitored the human systems, and what they have found is concerning. The main display showed images of human space. There were shipyards building vessels that dwarfed anything in the council fleet. There were defensive platforms that made the council perimeter look primitive by comparison. There were research stations and colonies and infrastructure that spoke of a civilization that had been building in secret while pretending to need council support. They were never dependent on us, Vex said as he studied the images. They were studying us and learning from us and building their own civilization while we patted ourselves on the back for civilizing them. A junior delegate who had been quiet until now spoke up. If they have all of this, why did they stay with the council for 200 years? Thrix considered the question. Perhaps they hoped we would eventually treat them as equals, he said slowly. Perhaps they believed in the ideals the council claims to represent even when we did not live up to those ideals. His scales shifted to a deep blue, which was the color of regret. Or perhaps they were simply waiting until they were strong enough to leave, and we finally gave them a reason to stop waiting. The Prime Minister returned to her platform, but she did not sit down. We will send a diplomatic mission to human space, she announced. We will offer them full membership with all rights and privileges, and we will apologize for how we treated them. Several delegates nodded in agreement, but Thrix felt a cold certainty in his core. They will refuse, he said. How can you know that? The Prime Minister asked. Because we had 200 years to offer them respect, and we chose mockery instead, Thrix replied. Because we built our civilization on their backs and never acknowledged their contributions, and because we are only offering them equality now that we need them, and they know it. The Prime Minister's silver skin seemed to pale even further. Then what do we do? Thrix looked at the tactical display showing pirates raiding with impunity and the medical reports showing thousands dying from treatable diseases and the NDHL. Economic projections showing system-wide collapse within a year. We learned to survive without them, he said. And we hope that future generations remember this lesson when they meet other species who seem less advanced than we are. The emergency session continued for 6 more hours as delegates tried to find solutions to problems that had no easy answers. They formed committees and assigned task forces and created emergency protocols, but everyone in the chamber knew the truth. The council had spent 10,000 years believing itself superior to all others, and in just 90 days, without humans, they had been proven catastrophically wrong. Thrix left the chamber as the artificial sun that lit the council world began to set. He thought about Kyle Bennett walking out 3 months ago and how the whole chamber had laughed. Nobody was laughing anymore. Director Paul Henderson stood in the command center overlooking Earth's primary orbital shipyard and watched the construction. Crews put the finishing touches on the newest addition to humanity's defense fleet. The ship was massive by any standard, and it used technology that would make the Council's military experts question everything they thought they knew about human capabilities. Paul had been planning for this moment for 30 years, and now that it had finally arrived, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. He had been a junior analyst when the Council rejected humanity's first petition for equal membership. That was 50 years ago, and he had watched the Council dismiss 7 more petitions over the following decades. Each rejection had been delivered with the same patronizing tone that suggested humans should be grateful for whatever scraps the Council chose to give them. Paul had stopped being grateful around the time of the 4th rejection, and started being strategic instead. Dr. Kate Sullivan entered the command center, carrying a datapad and looking tired but pleased. She had been back on Earth for 3 months now, and had spent most of that time reorganizing her research team and setting up new facilities that did not answer to Council oversight boards. Paul had known Kate for 15 years and had always respected her ability to see 10 steps ahead in any scientific problem. "The medical research facilities are fully operational," Kate said as she handed him the datapad. "We have everything we need to continue the Vardex plague research without any Council interference." Paul scrolled through the report. "How long until you have a working treatment?" 6 months, if we are lucky," Kate replied. "Maybe a year if we run into complications and the Council will not have anything close to a solution for at least 5 years, if they even figure out where to start." "People die because we are withholding this research?" Paul asked because the question had to be asked even though he already knew the answer. Kate's expression hardened. "People are already dying because the Council never valued the work we were doing, and if they had treated us as equals, we would still be there helping them. But they made their choice, and now they have to live with the consequences." Paul nodded slowly. He had struggled with the same moral questions when planning humanity's withdrawal. They were condemning millions of Council citizens to suffer because of decisions made by their leaders, but the alternative was condemning humanity to centuries more of servitude disguised as partnership. Sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. "Admiral Chris." Bennett walked into the command center, still wearing his flight suit from a training exercise. Chris was Kyle's younger brother, and while Kyle had fought the Council with diplomacy, Chris had been preparing to fight them with ships and weapons if necessary. The Admiral's face showed the same determined expression that Paul had seen on Kyle during their last conversation before the walkout. "The fleet is ready," Chris said without preamble. "We have 60 capital ships fully operational and another 40 that will be completed within 3 months, and every single one of them is superior to anything the Council has in their arsenal." "Tactical display showing human-controlled space? What about our defensive perimeter?" "Sam Torres finished the last section yesterday," Chris replied. "The defensive grid is now complete around all human territory, and it uses technology that the Council has not even theorized about. Yet, engineer Sam Torres had been a legend in human military circles for 20 years. He had worked on the Council's defensive perimeter while secretly designing improvements that he never shared with his Council supervisors. Those improvements had gone into humanity's own defensive systems, and the result was a network that could detect and neutralize threats before they even reached human. Space Paul looked at the 3 people in the command center with him and saw the same thing reflected in each of their faces. They were ready for whatever came next. Humanity had spent 2 centuries preparing for the possibility that the Council would never accept them as equals, and now that preparation was complete. "Have there been any communications from the Council?" Paul asked. Kate checked her datapad. 47 requests for diplomatic meetings in the past week alone, and the tone is getting increasingly desperate with each message. "Are they offering anything new?" "Full Council membership with all rights and privileges," Kate said. equal voting power on all council matters, and immediate access to all restricted technologies, and a formal apology from the Prime Minister herself. Paul felt no satisfaction hearing this. 50 years ago, I would have celebrated that offer, he said quietly. 20 years ago, I might have still considered it, and 10 years ago, I would have been suspicious but interested. He looked out at the shipyard where human workers were building a fleet that answered to no one but themselves. Now, it just makes me angry because they are not offering this because they believe we deserve it, but because they need us. Chris crossed his arms. So we refuse the meeting? No, Paul said after a moment of consideration. We accept the meeting, and we make sure they understand exactly what they lost. Kate raised an eyebrow. You want to reject them in person? I want them to see what we built while they were not paying attention, Paul replied. I want them to understand that we were never the dependent species they believed us to be, and I want them to know that their offer comes 200 years too late. 3 days later, Paul stood at the edge of human space and watched a council diplomatic ship approach. The ship was one of their finest vessels, and it carried a delegation, led by Ambassador Thrix himself, along with several high-ranking officials who had spent decades treating humans as inferiors. Paul had chosen to meet them here at the border rather than allowing them into human space because he wanted them to see what was waiting if they ever decided to become hostile. The council ship passed through a scanning field that would have been invisible to their sensors. That scan gave human defense forces a complete technical readout of their ship, including structural weaknesses and system vulnerabilities. It was not an aggressive act, just a demonstration of capability that the council would not even know had happened. Kyle Bennett arrived at the meeting station an hour before the council delegation. He had asked to be present for this meeting, and Paul had agreed because Kyle had earned the right to face the people who had dismissed him 3 months ago. The former ambassador looked calmer than Paul expected, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he had made peace with what was about to happen. Are you ready for this? Paul asked. Kyle nodded. I spent 5 years trying to make them respect us, and it never worked because respect cannot be demanded or earned through service alone, and it has to be given freely, or it means nothing. He looked out at the stars. They will offer us everything we ask for, and we will decline, and they will finally understand that some mistakes cannot be fixed. The council delegation arrived precisely on time. Thrix entered the meeting room first, and his scales were a neutral brown that suggested he was keeping tight control over his emotions. Behind him came the Zelthari Prime Minister, looking smaller, somehow without her elevated platform, and several other delegates who Paul recognized from intelligence reports. Thrix spoke first. Director Henderson, we appreciate you agreeing to this meeting, and we come with an offer that we hope will repair the relationship between humanity and the Council.
Oh.
Paul gestured for them to sit. I am listening. Prime Minister leaned forward. We offer humanity full membership in the Galactic Council with complete voting rights on all matters and immediate access to all Council technologies and resources. She paused. We also offer a formal apology for how we treated your people over the past 2 centuries. Why now? Kyle asked from his position near the window. The Prime Minister's silver skin darkened slightly. Because we were wrong about humanity, and we failed to recognize your contributions, and we need your help to repair the damage that has been done since your departure. You need us, Kyle repeated. Not you want us as equals, but you need us to fix your problems. Thrix's scales shifted to a darker brown. Both things can be true, he said. We need your help, and we also recognize that we should have offered you equality long ago. Paul pulled up a holographic display showing the current state of Council space. Pirates raiding freely and defensive systems failing, and economies collapsing, and disease spreading unchecked. You built a civilization on human labor and human innovation and human blood while telling yourselves that you were civilizing us, Paul said. Now you are discovering what your civilization looks like without us holding it together. Which is why we need you to return, the Prime Minister said. Doh. Paul replied simply. The Council delegates looked shocked. You refuse full membership, Thrix asked. We refuse to be part of a council that only values us when they need us, Kyle said. For 200 years you had the opportunity to treat us as partners and you chose to treat us as servants, and now you want us to forget that and come back because it is convenient for you. Paul stood and walked to the window. What you see here is the edge of human space, and beyond this point, you need our permission to enter. He pressed a button, and the view screen showed the defensive grid that Sam Torres had built. That network can track every ship in 100 light years and destroy any threat before it gets within weapons range of our territory, and the technology that makes it work is 50 years ahead of anything the Council has. Chris, Bennett appeared on the screen from his flagship. We have a fleet of 60 capital ships, with 40 more under construction, and each ship is more advanced than your best vessels, and we have weapon systems that your scientists have not even theorized about. Yet, Kate Sullivan's face replaced Chris on the screen. We have medical research facility that will produce treatments for diseases your people are dying from right now, and we have no intention of sharing that research with the Council. Paul turned back to the delegation. You are not here to offer us membership, and you are here to ask us to save you from the consequences of your own arrogance, and the answer is no. The Prime Minister's composure finally cracked. You would let millions die because of wounded pride? We would let millions die because their leader spent 200 years treating us like inferiors, Kyle said. You had every chance to avoid this outcome and you chose not to take it, and now it is too late. Thrick stood slowly. Is there nothing we can offer you? Paul considered the question. You can remember this moment, he finally said. When your civilization encounters another species, that seems less advanced than you are, remember? How badly you misjudged humanity and treat them better than you treated us. The Council delegation left without another word. Paul watched their ship turn away from human space and disappear into the distance. Kyle stood beside him, and they both knew that this was the end of something that had died long before today. Do you think they will survive? Kyle asked. Some of them will, Paul replied, and those who do will build something different, or they will repeat the same mistakes with someone else. Humanity had walked away and the door was closed and it would not open again. 6 months had passed since humanity rejected the Council's offer, and Kyle Bennett stood in his office on Earth, watching news feeds from across the galaxy. The Galactic Council was fragmenting in ways that historians would study for centuries, and the collapse was happening faster than even the most pessimistic human analysts had predicted. Kyle had been promoted to Secretary of Foreign Relations after the walkout, and now his job was to navigate humanity through a galaxy that was reorganizing itself around their absence. The first major fracture had come 3 months ago when the Krellian Empire invaded Council territory. The Krellians had been a rival power for thousands of years, but the Council's defensive perimeter had always kept them at bay. Without that perimeter, and without human military coordination, the Council forces had crumbled in weeks. For Council species had surrendered to the Krellians rather than face destruction in their territories now belonged to an empire that was growing bolder with each victory. Lisa Morgan entered the office, carrying reports from their intelligence network. She had been promoted to Director of External Affairs and spent most of her time tracking the chaos unfolding in former Council space. Her expression was troubled as she handed Kyle the latest analysis. The Vardix plague death toll reached 2 million yesterday, Lisa said quietly. The Council still has no effective treatment, and their medical infrastructure is collapsing under the strain. Kyle read through the report and felt the familiar weight of guilt that he had been carrying for months. Kate's team has a working treatment now, he said. We could save those people. Lisa agreed. But that would mean revealing our medical capabilities to a galaxy that still does not understand how far ahead we are, and it would mean helping a council that spent 200 years exploiting us. Kyle set down the report. I know the arguments, and I helped make the decision to withhold our research, but that does not make it easier to watch people die from something we can cure. Lisa sat down across from him. Director, Henderson wants to establish humanitarian corridors for refugees who want to flee Council space, and we have authorization to accept anyone who reaches our borders and asks for asylum. How many have come so far? Over 300,000 in the past 2 months, Lisa replied. Most of them are civilians from border systems, where the fighting is worst, and they are grateful to be alive and shocked that we are helping them after how the Council treated us. Kyle pulled up a map, showing human space and the surrounding regions. Red zones marked areas under Krellian control, while yellow zones showed Council territory that was still holding together, and green zones showed independent systems that had broken away from the Council entirely. The map looked like a puzzle that someone had dropped and scattered across the floor. What about the independent systems? Kyle asked. Have any of them reached out to us? Lisa nodded. 7 so far, and they are asking about trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and they all want to know if we are planning to build our own version of the Council. What did you tell them? That humanity is interested in partnerships based on mutual respect, and that we will not join any organization that treats member species as superior or inferior to one another, Lisa said. 3 of them have asked for formal treaty negotiations. Kyle considered this carefully. Humanity had walked away from the Council because of inequality and arrogance, but that did not mean they wanted to be isolated. The galaxy was too dangerous for any species to stand completely alone, and there were good people and other civilizations who deserved better than the Council had given them. Start the treaty negotiations, Kyle decided, but make it clear that we will only partner with species who treat us as equals, and we will walk away again if we see the same patterns that destroyed the Council. Admiral Chris Bennett arrived at the office an hour later. He had just returned from a patrol along the border where his fleet had intercepted a Krellian scouting force that wandered too close to human space. The Krellians had retreated quickly after scanning the human ships and realizing they were outmatched. The Krellians are testing our defenses, Chris said as he joined Kyle and Lisa. They took detailed scans of our ships before withdrawing, and they will be analyzing that data to find weaknesses. Will they find any? Kyle asked. Chris smiled without humor. They will find that our ships are faster and better armed and more heavily shielded than anything they have encountered before, and if they are smart, they will decide that invading human space would be a mistake. And if they are not smart, then we will demonstrate why humanity spent 200 years learning from every species in the Council while revealing nothing about our own capabilities, Chris replied. The Krellians have been fighting Council species who learned warfare from the same tired doctrines for thousands of years, and we learned those same doctrines. And then we improved on them and added tactics the Council never imagined. Kyle walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Earth had changed in the months since the walkout, and there was an energy in the streets that reminded him of historical periods. When humanity had broken free from oppressive systems, people were excited about the future in a way they had not been when they were just another provisional member waiting for Council approval. Do you ever regret it? Kyle asked. Walking out, I mean? Chris and Lisa exchanged glances. No, Chris said firmly. We gave the Council 200 years to do the right thing. They never did, and staying would have meant accepting permanent second-class status. What about you? Lisa asked Kyle. You were the one who had to make the decision to walk out, and you have been carrying the weight of the consequences ever since. Kyle thought about the question. I regret that it was necessary, he said slowly. I regret that the Council could not see past their own arrogance, and I regret the people who are dying because their leaders failed them, but I do not regret giving humanity the chance to stand on our own. Communication alert interrupted their conversation. Paul Henderson appeared on the screen from his office in the defense sector. His expression was serious but not alarmed. We have a situation developing at the border, Paul said. A Council refugee fleet of over 500 ships is requesting asylum, and they are being pursued by Krellian forces. Kyle felt his stomach tighten. 500 ships meant hundreds of thousands of refugees, and the Krellians would not stop their pursuit just because the refugees crossed into human space. What is the fleet composition? Mostly civilian transports and light freighters, Paul replied. Maybe a dozen escort vessels that look like they have seen heavy combat, and the Krellian pursuit force includes 3 heavy cruisers. Chris was already pulling up tactical displays. We have 4 ships in that sector, and I can have 8 more. They're in 30 minutes, but engaging the Krellians. Means we are declaring ourselves hostile to their expansion. If we turn away the refugees, we are condemning them to death or slavery, Lisa said. The Krellians do not take prisoners during their expansion campaigns. Kyle looked at the 3 people waiting for his decision. This was the moment where humanity had to choose what kind of civilization they would be. They could protect their own interests and let the refugees face their fate, or they could extend their protection to people who were suffering because of a system that humanity had also rejected. Authorize our fleet to escort the refugees to safety, Kyle said. If the Krellians cross into human space, they are to be warned once and then disabled if they continue. Chris nodded and started issuing orders. Paul coordinated with the Border Defense Forces, and Lisa began preparing facilities to process hundreds of thousands of refugees. Kyle watched them work and felt something shift in his chest. Humanity was no longer just walking away from a broken system. They were starting to build something new. The engagement at the border lasted 7 minutes. The Krellian cruisers pursued the refugee fleet across the border into human space and were warned to withdraw. When they ignored the warning, human ships disabled all 3 cruisers with weapons that the Krellians had never seen before. The refugee fleet was escorted to safety, and the disabled Krellian ships were allowed to retreat after their crews witnessed what human military technology could do. News of the engagement spread quickly through the galaxy. Humanity had not just defended refugees. They had casually defeated a force that had been crushing Council military units for months. Species across the galaxy began to reassess their understanding of human capabilities, and several more independent systems reached out requesting treaty stock. Kyle stood in the operations center and watched the refugee ships arrive at human stations. Families who had lost everything were being given shelter and food and medical care by a species that had every reason to turn them away. Some of the refugees were from species that had voted against human equality in the Council, and Kyle wondered what they thought now as humans saved their lives. Ambassador Thrix was among the refugees. His scales were a pale gray that showed exhaustion and defeat when Kyle met him at the processing center. The once proud Vraxian who had mocked humanity now stood with nothing but the clothes he was wearing. "Why did you save us?" Thrix asked. "After everything the Council did to your people, why would you risk war with the Krellians to protect refugees?" Kyle looked at the Vraxian for a long moment. "Because we are better than the Council was," he said simply. "We do not help people because they deserve it or because we will get something in return, and we help them because it is right." Thrix's scales shifted through several colors. "I was wrong about your species," he said quietly. "I was wrong about everything." "Yes, you were," Kyle agreed. "But you have the chance to learn from that mistake and help build something better than what the Council became." Over the following months, humanity established treaties with 18 independent systems based on principles of equality and mutual benefit. The Krellian Empire stopped expanding toward human space after their encounter with human military technology. The Council continued to fragment as more species chose independence over a system that had failed them. Kate Sullivan's medical research was eventually shared with refugee populations, and then, with treaty partners, and the Vardex plague was brought under control. Human technology and knowledge began spreading through the galaxy, but this time it was shared as gifts between equals rather than taken by superiors from inferiors. Kyle stood in his office a year after the walkout and looked at the new map of the galaxy. It was still chaotic, and there were still wars and suffering, but there were also new alliances forming based on respect rather than domination. Humanity had walked away from the Council, and in doing so, had given other species permission to imagine something different. The age of the Galactic Council was over, and what came next was uncertain, but Kyle believed it would be better. Humanity had proven that walking away from a broken system was possible, and that standing on your own was better than kneeling as part of someone else's. Hierarchy. Did the Council finally understood what they had lost, But understanding came too late. Humanity had moved on, and the galaxy was moving with them, towards something new.